In the spring of 1859, Antoine Dubois, a prominent Creole merchant whose family had commanded respect in New Orleans for generations, brought a woman to his decaying Garden District mansion. She was not a guest, she was a purchase. She arrived in a closed carriage at dusk, a time when the oppressive Louisiana heat gives way to a thick, spectral miasma that rises from the damp earth. She was tall and slender, dressed in a heavy funereal gown of black silk, her face entirely obscured by a mourning veil of impossible thickness. She moved with a silent, unnatural grace as if floating over the flagstones. And from the moment she stepped across the threshold of the Dubois home, she never spoke a single word. The historical record is almost silent on this woman. A single cryptic bill of sale unearthed in a forgotten parish courthouse archive in 1948 lists the transaction: the purchase of an unnamed octoroon female age approximately 22 for an astronomical sum, far exceeding the market price for even the most prized enslaved person. But the document is strange. It refers to the purchase not as one of chattel, but as an oblation perpetuelle, a perpetual offering. It is the first clue in a story that spirals from the social horror of slavery into a far darker realm of sinister religious pacts and a mystery that consumed a family from within. What follows is an account pieced together from the primary source of this tragedy: the secret sealed journal of Antoine Dubois' only son, Julien, who witnessed these events as a child and wrote his testimony decades later as a haunted old man, the sole survivor of the horror that unfolded within his home. Before we open the pages of that journal and descend into the Dubois family's nightmare, I want to ask you something. If you believe history is filled with secrets that were meant to stay buried and that exhuming them is a necessary act, hit that subscribe button now. This channel is dedicated to that dark work, and I want to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment telling me your city or state. It is a chilling exercise to see how close we all live to forgotten histories. Now, let us go back to New Orleans, to a house of secrets and the arrival of the mourning bride. Julien Dubois' journal begins not with an explanation, but with a child's sensory memory of fear. "I was 9 years old when she came," he wrote in a shaky but elegant hand in 1905. "I remember the reaction of the household staff most clearly. These were enslaved men and women who had seen the brutalities of life, who feared the master's hand and the auction block. But they did not look upon this new woman with pity. They looked at her with a profound and spiritual terror. Elodie, our head housekeeper, a woman whose stoicism was legendary, made a small warding sign with her fingers as the silent figure passed. I saw another servant touch a hidden gris-gris bag at his neck. They were not afraid for her, they were afraid of her. I knew then, with the unformed certainty of a child, that she was not just a new slave, she was something else." The Dubois mansion was a perfect vessel for such a presence. A grand, double-galleried house with towering columns, it was a monument to a decaying fortune. The facade, though impressive, was stained with mildew from the relentless humidity. Inside, priceless French furniture stood next to empty spaces on the walls, where paintings had been sold to cover Antoine's mounting debts. The air itself was heavy, thick with the scent of sweet olive and the underlying smell of rot from the damp, shaded gardens. The house, like the Dubois family, was a gilded cage, beautiful on the surface, but filled with a quiet, creeping desperation. Antoine Dubois, Julien's father, was a man living a lie. To New Orleans society, he was a respected merchant, his days spent at his offices in the French Quarter. But Julien's later research, cross-referencing his father's business ledgers, revealed the truth. By 1859, Antoine's shipping business was on the verge of collapse. A series of disastrous investments in Cuban sugar, a lost cargo ship in a hurricane, and his own profligate spending had left him facing utter ruin. The purchase of the mourning bride for a sum that could have cleared a third of his debts was an act not of wealth, but of supreme, terrifying desperation. The woman was given a name, or rather a title. She was referred to only as La Dame en Deuil, the lady in mourning. She was sequestered in a suite of rooms in the mansion's east wing, a section of the house that was kept permanently shuttered. The rules governing her existence, as observed by the young, watchful Julien, were rigid, bizarre, and absolute. They were the rules of a ritual, not a life. She was to remain in her rooms at all times except for a single hour at dusk, when she was permitted to walk alone in a walled-off section of the garden, a place overgrown with weeping willows and shadowed ivy. She was to be served simple meals of bread, water, and unseasoned vegetables on a silver tray left outside her door. Her room contained no personal effects, no books, no mirrors. The great pier glass that had once stood in the room was removed, its absence leaving a pale, ghostly rectangle on the damask wallpaper. The only objects permitted were a bed, a chair, and a single stark crucifix of black ebony. And above all, the primary rule, she was never ever to speak, and no one was to speak to her. Julien, in his journal, describes his childish attempts to understand her. He would hide in the garden, watching her pace slowly under the dying light, a silent black-clad specter. He was tormented by the sight of her veiled face. What was beneath it? A visage of profound sorrow, a disfigurement, or nothing at all. He writes of a desperate desire to hear her voice, imagining it might be beautiful or monstrous or perhaps simply ordinary. Her silence was a void that he and the entire household filled with their own fears. He sought answers from the head housekeeper, Elodie, an older Creole woman who was a devout Catholic but whose faith was interwoven with the darker, older traditions of Louisiana voodoo. He found her polishing silver in the pantry, a rosary coiled on the table next to her. "Elodie, who is she?" the young Julien asked. Elodie did not stop her work. Her hands moved in slow, methodical circles. "She is a prayer, little master, a prayer for a house that is sick. Why doesn't she speak? Some prayers must be silent. The loudest cries are the ones you cannot hear. She speaks to le silencieux." "The silent one? Who is that?" Elodie paused then, her dark eyes meeting his. "There are the saints you see in the cathedral, and there are the saints that live in the swamp. There are the gods you pray to for light, and there are the gods you bargain with in the dark. Le silencieux is a god of silence and debt. He eats grief. And when a man owes a debt he cannot pay in gold, he can sometimes pay in sorrow. But the price is high. A soul for a purse. Now, ask no more questions, Julien. Some doors are best left unopened." Elodie's cryptic warnings only fueled Julien's obsession. He began to spy on his father. He became aware of the late-night meetings, the arrival of other powerful, desperate men. A cotton broker whose warehouses had been ravaged by fire, a shipping magnate who had lost 2 ships in as many months. They would gather in his father's study, the air thick with cigar smoke and whiskey. Julien, hiding in the hallway, would strain to hear their words through the heavy cypress door. They did not speak like businessmen. They spoke like members of a secret lodge, like a cult. He heard phrases that made no sense to him then, but which he recorded phonetically in his journal. "The offering is accepted. The silence holds. The accounts will turn. The pact must be honored to the letter." It was a conspiracy. His father was not alone in his dark bargain. The desperate need to understand drove Julien to an act of profound transgression. He waited for a night when his father was away attending one of his secret society meetings. He stole the key to his father's study from its hiding place. Inside, the room was a shrine to his father's anxieties. Business ledgers showing columns of red ink lay open next to half-empty bottles of brandy. And on the desk, Julien found two pieces of evidence that would shatter his childhood and define the rest of his life. The first was the bill of sale. It was not a standard slave market document. It was written in archaic, formal French on a heavy sheet of vellum, its ink faded to a rusty brown. It documented the sale of an unnamed octoroon female formerly known as Celeste, from a special brokerage in the Faubourg Marigny, a district known for its shadow economy. The document was filled with legalistic, quasi-religious language. It described her not as labor, but as an oblation perpetuelle, a perpetual offering, transferred to Antoine Dubois for the purpose of spiritual appeasement. The price was listed, a figure so high it confirmed Julien's suspicion that this was an act of ultimate desperation. The document was countersigned by the other men who visited the house, a pact sealed in blood and ink. The second object was a locked ledger bound in black leather with no title on its spine. After a frantic search, Julien found a small key hidden in a hollowed-out book. What he found inside was not a record of finances, but a record of faith, a dark faith. It was the doctrine of a secret society, a cabal that called themselves Les Pénitents de Saint Jude le Silencieux, the penitents of Saint Jude the Silent. It was a syncretic cult, a monstrous fusion of heretical Catholicism and Louisiana voodoo. The journal detailed their belief system. They worshipped a hybrid entity, a combination of Saint Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, and a forgotten voodoo loa of the grave and silence. This entity, Le Silencieux, was a god of bargains. He could reverse ruin, restore fortunes, and silence enemies, but he did not accept prayers or candles. He accepted only one currency: sustained, silent, human suffering. The ledger laid out the rules of the oblation of the mourning bride. A woman of beauty and sorrow, preferably one with no family to seek her, was to be purchased. She was to be ritually married to the silent god, her life and soul forfeit. From that moment on, she was to live in perpetual mourning, not for a person but for her own lost spirit. Her silence was a vow, her isolation a penance. Her constant unspoken grief was the offering, a spiritual sustenance that would feed the entity. In return, the entity would grant its favor, financial and political, to the bride's keeper, her owner. The ledger was filled with horrifying, meticulous rules. The bride must never see her own reflection, lest she remember the soul she has lost. She must never hear music, lest it stir a joy that profanes her sorrow. She must never be touched by an unconsecrated hand, and she must never ever speak. For her voice, if used, would shatter the pact and unleash a ruin tenfold. Julien, shaking, closed the ledger. He understood now. The woman in the East Wing was not a slave in the conventional sense. She was a living sacrifice, a human vessel for his family's ambition and despair. The house was not just her prison, it was her tomb. He returned the key and the books, his mind reeling. For weeks he lived in a state of quiet terror, seeing his home, his family, his entire world through a new, horrified lens. His mother, a frail, nervous woman who lived in a laudanum-induced haze, seemed blissfully unaware of the dark current running beneath her home. His father, once a figure of authority, now seemed like a desperate, damned man, a high priest of a quaint, terrible religion. And then the most horrifying part began. The pact started to work. In the summer of 1859, the news began to arrive. A rival shipping company in Mobile suddenly went bankrupt, allowing Antoine's struggling business to acquire its roots for pennies on the dollar. The cargo ship that had been presumed lost in the Caribbean a year prior miraculously arrived in port, its crew telling a wild tale of being stranded on an uncharted island, its valuable cargo of sugar and rum intact. A wealthy uncle in France died without an heir, leaving a significant portion of his fortune to the Dubois family. With each piece of good news, Antoine Dubois would grow more confident, his posture straighter. But he would also spend more time in his study, drinking heavily, his eyes darting with a fear that Julien now understood. He was a man who had sold a soul for fortune and was terrified of the seller. The change in the household was palpable. New furniture arrived, the peeling paint was covered with a fresh coat, the finest wines were served at dinner. The Dubois family was prosperous again, and through it all, the mourning bride, Celeste, remained in her silent rooms, a living, breathing engine of suffering, powering the family's renewed success with her unending grief. Julien was tormented by guilt. He was eating fine food, wearing new clothes, living a life of luxury that was being purchased every single day by the silent damnation of the woman in the East Wing. He would lie in bed at night and try to imagine her existence, a perpetual twilight of silence and sorrow, a life without hope, without connection, without even the memory of her own face in a mirror. What kind of God or devil would demand such a price? And what kind of man would be willing to pay it? His childish fear of her began to transform into a profound, aching pity. He started to see her not as a terrifying specter, but as a prisoner. He began leaving small, secret offerings of his own outside her door, breaking the rules in tiny, insignificant ways. A lump of sugar from the dessert tray, a single perfect camellia from the garden left on the silver tray that held her meager dinner. They were small, desperate acts of a guilty conscience. They were always gone when the tray was retrieved, but he never knew if she took them, or if a servant simply cleared them away. He knew he was playing with fire. He had read the ledger. He knew the rules. The silence must hold. But the compassion of a child is a powerful, reckless thing, and he could not bear the thought of her utter desolation. He felt he had to do something more, something to give her a single moment of beauty, a single crack of light in her endless twilight. In the autumn of 1859, his father brought home a gift for his mother from a trip to Paris. It was a small, exquisite music box made of polished rosewood and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. When opened, it played a delicate, heartbreakingly beautiful melody from a Chopin nocturne. His mother, in her usual haze, barely acknowledged it. It was placed on a mantelpiece and forgotten, but Julien did not forget. The music haunted him. It was the antithesis of the mourning bride's world. It was pure, expressive, emotional sound. One evening, when his father was away at a meeting of the penitents and his mother was asleep in a laudanum dream, Julien acted. With his heart pounding, he took the music box from the parlor. He crept down the silent, shadowed hallway to the East Wing, to the door of the mourning bride's prison. He knew he should not speak to her. He knew he should not enter. But the rule book had said nothing about sound from the outside. He knelt by the door, placed the music box on the floor, and slowly, carefully lifted the lid. The first crystalline notes of the nocturne spilled into the oppressive silence of the hallway. The music was impossibly fragile, impossibly beautiful. It was a sound of life in a house of the dead. He played it for only a minute, a desperate offering of beauty to the woman suffering on the other side of the door. Then he closed the lid, grabbed the box, and fled back to his room, terrified of what he had done. He expected punishment, a reprimand from his father, a strange shift in the household's luck. But nothing happened. The next day was the same as the one before, and the day after that. The family's fortunes continued to rise. Julien began to believe his small transgression had gone unnoticed by whatever dark entity they served. He was wrong. He had not gone unnoticed. He had simply misunderstood the nature of the pact. He had not broken it. He had introduced a new, unforeseen variable. He had reminded the sacrifice that a world of beauty still existed. He had planted a seed of hope in barren ground, and that seed, he would learn, would grow into a far more terrible and destructive thing than any simple sudden wrath. He had not angered the silent god. He had armed its prisoner. The music box incident was a turning point, though its consequences did not manifest immediately. In his journal, Julien Dubois describes the weeks that followed as a period of unnerving calm. The family's newfound prosperity stabilized. His father, Antoine, seemed to relax for the first time in years, the haunted, desperate look in his eyes replaced by the confident air of a man who had made a dark bargain and found it to be a profitable one. The meetings of the Pénitents de Saint-Jude-le-Silencieux continued, but they were now celebratory, filled with the clinking of crystal and self-congratulatory toasts to their wise investment. It seemed as though Julien's small act of compassionate rebellion had gone unnoticed by the universe. But Julien himself was changed. His pity for the mourning bride had now deepened into a profound personal sense of responsibility. He had offered her a glimpse of a world she was forbidden, a memory of beauty in her desolate existence. He began to watch her more closely during her dusk walks in the walled garden, and he started to notice a subtle shift. Before, her movements had been slow, aimless, a ghostly drift. Now he perceived a new tension in her posture. A stillness that was not one of resignation but of listening. He would see her head tilt slightly as if catching a distant sound on the breeze. Her silent pacing seemed less like a prisoner's march, and more like the caged stride of a predator. Then came the first sign that the pact was beginning to fray at the edges. One evening, Elodie, the head housekeeper, came to Antoine Dubois with a disturbed expression. She reported that the silver tray left outside the bride's door had been altered. The simple meal was untouched, but the bride had arranged the bread crusts and vegetable peelings into a strange, intricate spiral pattern on the plate. "It is a veuve," Elodie whispered to the master, her voice trembling. Julien, hiding in an adjacent room, strained to hear. "A sign. It is not for the one you serve. It is a call to another. To him." "To who?" Antoine demanded, his voice tight with a new fear. "Papa Legba," Elodie breathed. "The opener of the way, the one who stands at the crossroads between the world of spirits and the world of men. She is asking for a door to be opened. She is breaking her silence without making a sound." Antoine dismissed her with a wave of his hand, telling her not to speak of such foolish superstitions again. But Julien saw the sweat on his father's brow. That night, the hushed, urgent voices from the study were not triumphant. They were frightened. The members of the cabal had never considered that their living sacrifice might have a will of her own, a faith of her own, a power of her own. They had bought a body and a soul, but they had not bought her mind. The strange occurrences escalated. A week later, a servant sent to clean the bride's rooms, a task performed in haste while she was in the garden, found a symbol drawn in the dust on the floor beneath the bed. It was another veuve, this one for Baron Samedi, the loa of the dead, the master of the cemetery. The servant, a young girl, was so terrified she became hysterical and had to be sent away. Antoine's carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. His prosperity depended entirely on the perfect, silent suffering of his offering. But she was no longer suffering passively. She was communicating. She was praying to her own gods, dark and powerful entities that existed outside the twisted Catholic framework of the penitence pact. The mourning bride was no longer just a vessel of sorrow. She was becoming a conduit for something else. The narrator, Julien, looking back from the vantage point of old age, theorized on what was happening. The music box, he wrote, was a key. It did not break the pact, but it unlocked her memory of a life before, a life with sound and beauty and, I now believe, a faith of her own. My father's cult sought to empty her, to make her a blank slate for their own ritual. But they failed. You cannot empty a soul, you can only suppress it. The music woke her up, and once she was awake, she began to fight back, not with screams or violence, but with the only language left to her, the silent, terrifying language of signs and symbols. The breaking point came on a humid, storm-heavy night in December of 1859. It was the night of the winter solstice, a date Julien later learned was significant in both pagan and certain voodoo traditions. Antoine Dubois was hosting a meeting of the penitents. They were celebrating a full year of their successful pact. Julien, now 10 years old, was supposed to be in bed. But a strange energy in the house, a palpable electric tension, kept him awake. He crept from his room and down the grand, curving staircase. From the parlor he could hear their loud, drunken laughter. But from the east wing, from the corridor leading to the mourning bride's rooms, he heard something else. A sound he had never heard before in that house. A low, rhythmic humming. It was a woman's voice, deep and resonant. A sound that seemed to vibrate in the very wood of the house. It was her. After months of absolute silence, she was making a sound. Julien followed the sound, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. He reached her door and pressed his ear against the cold wood. The humming was a chant, a wordless melodic prayer that was mournful and powerful all at once. It was the sound of a ritual being performed. And then another sound began. A faint rhythmic scratching from inside the room. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. Unable to contain his curiosity, Julien dropped to his knees and peered through the large, old-fashioned keyhole. What he saw would be seared into his memory for the next 50 years. The room was lit by a single flickering candle that should not have been there. The mourning bride, Celeste, had removed her veil. In the wavering light, Julien saw her face for the first and only time. It was a face of breathtaking sculptural beauty, the face of a queen, but it was contorted in a mask of intense, ecstatic concentration. Her pale gray eyes, which he now saw were identical to his own, were rolled back in her head. The scratching sound was coming from her. She knelt on the floor, a piece of charcoal in her hand. Where had she gotten it? And was meticulously drawing a vast, complex symbol on the floorboards. It was a vive, more elaborate than any Julien had seen before. And at its center, with a sliver of broken glass from a water goblet, she was cutting small, precise lines into her own forearm, letting her blood drip and pool into the center of the drawing. She was performing her own sacrifice, an offering of her own blood to her own gods to counter the one that was being forced upon her. At that moment, the laughter from the parlor suddenly died. There was a crash of breaking glass. Julien's father shouted his name, his voice sharp with alarm. "Julien, where are you?" Footsteps pounded in the hall. Julien scrambled back from the door just as his father and the other men rounded the corner. They saw the candlelight under the bride's door. They heard the humming, and their faces, flushed with brandy and self-congratulation, turned to masks of pure animal terror. "She's breaking the pact," one of the men whispered, his voice shaking. Antoine Dubois did not hesitate. He pulled a large iron key from his pocket and threw open the door. The moment the door opened, the humming stopped. The candle flame was extinguished as if by an unseen breath, plunging the room into absolute darkness. But not before Julien saw her face turn toward them, her eyes now clear and focused, locking onto his father's. The expression in them was not of fear or madness, it was one of cold, triumphant victory. A scream tore through the house, but it was not from the mourning bride. It was from Antoine Dubois. He staggered back, clutching his chest, his face contorting in agony. "My heart," he gasped, before collapsing to the floor. Chaos erupted. The other men, the penitents, did not rush to help their friend. They fled. They ran from the house like rats from a sinking ship, their faces white with terror. They knew what this meant. The pact was broken. The protection was gone. The bill had come due. Julienne's mother, roused by the commotion, appeared at the top of the stairs, a confused, ghostly figure in her nightdress. Servants came running, but it was too late. Antoine Dubois died on the floor of the hallway, outside the door of the woman he had purchased to be his silent offering. An autopsy, perfunctory and discreet, would later list the cause of death as a massive coronary event. But Julien knew better. He had seen the look in the mourning bride's eyes. It was a murder committed without a weapon, without a sound. In the confusion, no one thought to check on the bride herself. When Elodie, the housekeeper, finally found the courage to enter the room with a lamp an hour later, it was empty. The window was open, its latch broken. The heavy curtains billowed in the night wind. On the floor was the elaborate, blood-fed vase, already starting to dry. But of the woman, Celeste, the mourning bride, there was no trace. She had vanished as completely as if she had been a spirit all along. The ruin that followed was swift and absolute, a perfect, horrifying inversion of the blessings the pact had brought. 2 days after Antoine's funeral, a telegram arrived. The cargo ship that had miraculously returned, the foundation of their restored wealth, had caught fire at the docks in Charleston. Its entire cargo of sugar and rum a total loss. The fire had spread, destroying 2 of the warehouses that held the family's cotton. The insurance company, citing suspicious circumstances, refused to pay. A week later, a bank in Mobile called in a massive loan, one Antoine had used to expand his business. Without the profits from the lost cargo, the family could not pay. Creditors descended, seizing assets, property, and finally the mansion itself. But the entity they had bargained with was not only interested in finances, it came for the people. One of the penitents, the cotton broker, was found hanged in his office. Another, the shipping magnate, was lost at sea when his own schooner went down in a sudden localized squall on a perfectly clear day. Within a year, all the men who had countersigned the bill of sale were dead, each by a strange, violent, and seemingly coincidental fate. Julien and his mother were cast out of the mansion, left with nothing. They moved into a small rented room in a less fashionable part of the city. Julien's mother, deprived of her laudanum and her life of leisure, withered. Her mind, already fragile, shattered completely. She died in a charity asylum in 1862, whispering the name of a husband who had damned them all. Julien survived. He alone was left, a boy of 11, an orphan with no fortune and a terrible secret. He was taken in by a distant cousin of his mother's, a kind but impoverished family. He spent the rest of his life haunted by what he had witnessed. He saw the mourning bride everywhere, in the face of a silent woman on the street, in the rustle of a black dress, in the sound of a mournful melody. As an old man, he dedicated himself to finding the truth. His journal is filled with his research. He tried to trace the special brokerage that had sold Celeste to his father. He found that it had been a front for the penitents, a mechanism for acquiring their victims. He tried to find out who Celeste was before she became the mourning bride. He discovered through back-channel inquiries that she was likely the daughter of a powerful free man of color who had been murdered. His family sold into slavery to erase his bloodline, a woman with a deep well of sorrow and rage long before his father ever found her. Most chillingly, he discovered that his father's group was not the only one. He found oblique references in old letters and diaries to other mourning brides in other cities, Charleston, Savannah, even as far north as Baltimore. It seemed there were other chapters of the same dark faith, other wealthy, desperate men making the same terrible pacts. It was a hidden cancer within the heart of the slave-owning society. Julien Dubois died in 1908. He never married. He never had children. He left his journal and his research to the Historical Society, with the instruction that it not be unsealed until the world was ready to believe that the greatest horrors are not committed by demons but by men who would bargain with them. The Dubois mansion in the Garden District stood empty for years, a place of dark local legends. Children dared each other to touch its gates. It was finally torn down in the 1880s. During the demolition, workers in the garden unearthed a small, rotted wooden box buried near the old wall. Inside, they found a handful of strange objects: a small, tarnished silver music box, a dried camellia flower, and a single child-sized porcelain doll, dressed in a miniature hand-sewn black mourning gown, its painted face covered by a tiny black veil. The story of the mourning bride is a historical black hole. It exists only in the haunted testimony of a single witness and the corroborating fragments he spent a lifetime gathering. It is a story about the intersection of slavery's commodification of human life and a dark, syncretic faith that took that commodification to its terrifying metaphysical conclusion. It serves as a chilling reminder that in the desperate pursuit of wealth and power, men have always been willing to make bargains, and that there are some debts that can only be paid in blood and in silence.